Hi, this is Paul. Jonathan Pageau just did a video on Kanye West running for president, and I don't know why, but it really changed some of my thinking about some things, and I'm still very much processing it. And as is my practice, I process this on my monologues. I know some of you who want nice, short, concise videos by me giving you truth in nice little packages. Well, sorry, that isn't it. If you want that, start a clip channel with any insights that you find helpful, because I don't generally necessarily know what I say, whether what I say is helpful or not. I just say it, I put it out there, and I let y'all sort it out. But anyway, this video that Jonathan did on Kanye for president really got me thinking about a whole bunch of things that sort of these last 3 years have sort of been putting together, including why Jordan Peterson struck the nerve he did, what's happening with Kanye, what's happening with Pageau, all of this stuff. So let's jump into the middle.
So let's look at his bid for presidency. He started with a tweet in which he said, "We must now realize the promise of America by trusting God, unifying our vision, and building our future. I'm running for president of the United States." And so the interesting thing to note.
Now, what's sort of funny is that it was the afternoon that Kanye tweeted this. I picked it up and I was sitting around with my family and I said, guess who announced they were running for president? And my son Jared, who many of you know because he's been with me on some of the Jordan Peterson stuff, especially the local meetups, first word out of his mouth was Kanye West. And nobody else quite believed that. And then a bunch of people tried other ideas and waited for me. And I said, has everybody done guessing? I said, Kanye West. And it was sort of a joke because Kanye is Kanye. And he's known for saying surprising things and doing surprising things and sort of being all over the map. And then Jonathan, this was kind of right on Brett Weinstein's Unity 2020 campaign about recruiting a moderate Democrat and a moderate Republican, and then switching after 4 years, which interestingly enough isn't that different from one of the early schemes that the Constitution tried to figure out how the president should be. And of course, George Washington didn't want there to be political parties. But then I thought, yeah, Brett, what do you think of your idea now? And then Brett was all over it in terms of, oh, Kanye, talk to me. And I thought, one of the things that Brett had said he had wanted for his presidential candidate was competence. Now, would Kanye be a competent president of the United States? And so this Sunday I asked Freddie, and I don't often put a lot of stuff in the Freddie and Paul show that crosses over into my monologues, but I was kind of curious what Freddie would say, because Freddie listens to far more rap than I do. And so I asked Freddie what he thought. And one of the things that I put together was that in some ways Freddie has always been my Kanye. Because Freddie has this capacity sometimes to say something that sort of makes the light go on. And if you go all the way back to like the second or third Freddie and Paul show that I did with Freddie, he said a couple of things in those videos that they often don't wind up being in the Freddie and Paul show, because I'm usually trying to, once I turn the camera on, Freddie wants to sort of be a certain way because he thinks he should be that way in front of the camera. And so often, a number of the things that Freddie says off camera strike me as very Kanye-ish. And so this past Sunday when I did the Freddie and Paul show and I asked about Kanye, I thought some of Freddie's answers to me were quite interesting. And that was especially after listening to this video with Jonathan. And so let's hear some of what Jonathan says, and I'll tell you how this is changing my thinking.
this in his tweet is just how concise the tweet is and how powerful the tweet is. You can imagine him, I don't know that he put that out, really very intuitively, but in the tweet you can see exactly the things that people need to understand, the very deep wisdom that I'm talking about, that no one dares to say anymore. He's saying things.
Okay, that no one dares to say anymore. And this is going to be a pattern in Jonathan's talk here. And again, as I get into this video, and unlike what I usually do, I usually have my whole PowerPoint scripted out. And I don't have that for this video because I haven't been ready to kind of coalesce it yet, which might make this video an enormous mistake or an enormous mess. But here we go.
Things that no one has the guts to talk about.
No one has the guts to talk about. Why? Because if you talk about it in a certain way, you lose status. And again, it's not only status. I think about Brett Weinstein's conversation with, I think it was Daniel Schmachtenberger, about status. That status isn't the only thing, but status is a very big deal.
And so he starts with the notion of trusting God, unifying our vision and building the future. Now, this is really the structure of reality. That is, that in order to build something, you need to have a unifying vision. And
now, what he says right there is so key and so important. In order to build something, you need to have a unifying vision. Well, what does Jonathan mean by that? Well, let's say you want to build Jonathan will use various illustrations, and he just did a conversation on the Stoa, probably very similar to the time that he made this video. If you want to build a gun club, and the point of your gun club is about talking about guns and maybe going to the firing range and gun safety and all of that, and someone brings up cooking into the club, and they say, well, I don't like guns, but I like cooking. And everybody likes the person, and they don't want to be mean to the person, so they say, okay, you can be in our gun club even though you don't like guns, but you like cooking. At some point, there's going to be a conflict within the group. Is this a gun club or a cooking club? And at some point, they're going to have to make a decision. And so what that means is that the mission of the club defines what happens in the club. And that mission of the club limits what happens in the club. And that doesn't mean that in the midst of your gun club meeting you can't share recipes and maybe eat some tasty treats that some of you who both like guns and cooking enjoy. But the gun club thing sort of puts a cap on the organization. Now, if you want to include everything, well, you're going to need something on top that includes everything. Now, the problem that human beings have is that we have a great deal of difficulty with everything because everything is so big and we are so small. And so if you have a club that say, this club is about everything, well, who's in the club? Well, everyone. Well, not everyone is going to come to the club, and not everyone can come to the club, and not everyone can participate in the club. And this is part of the difficulty that we're hitting with a lot of these ideas. And so as the point Jonathan is about to make, the reason you use God, and this gets into God number one and God number two, God number one is both everything, but then also more than everything, okay? Because if you limit God number one sort of like to a pantheistic idea, then God is no longer transcendent over the everything, all right? And that's a really important point. Now look at Jonathan go some more.
The difficulty is, where do you put the unifying vision? Now, those who are wise have understood that the higher you put this unifying vision, the better chance you have of actually being able to build something that's going to hold.
Now, when Jonathan says higher, fairness to, if you go way back and you see a conversation between Jordan Peterson and Jonathan and Brett Weinstein keeps using this language of higher, and Brett Weinstein keeps using, trying to speak scientifically, and Jonathan calls him on that. And they've never had that conversation. And I can very much understand why Jonathan called him on that, because what Jonathan was basically saying is, you can't use that word and I'm going to add some of my own different language, within the scientific frame. Because there's no such thing as higher animals in the scientific frame. Darwin recognized this because higher implies a certain hierarchy. That's sort of how this stuff works. And so the reason that you put everything under God is because God is the highest possible thing. And even though God is not a thing, and that's where we get into the meta-divine realm and the Jewish Bible, the Christian, the Jewish scriptures, which basically I would assert the Jewish scriptures understood that if there's a meta-divine realm, then there's something higher than God, and then you just have gods. And so God is being beyond being, and that's where we get into all this Heideggerian language. But this is the point that Jonathan is making.
And of course, the highest thing that you can look to unify your vision is God.
Now, this is where God number one and God number two come in, because God number one has sort of and I often use the Isaiah passage, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. That's the holy, holy, holy. That's, as out there as can be, the whole earth is full of his glory. So then you have the wholeness of his glory all over the verse and the transcendence. So you have the immanence and the transcendence, okay? And that's basically how the God of the Bible, that's what the God of the Bible, see, language really breaks down here. It gets very difficult, but that's how the God of the Bible is different from Zeus or Apollo or any of these other gods.
And that is why you have in the United States the last, let's say, desire to hold unity within the United States was done under the guise of God. We see it in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Now, Jonathan is a Canadian, and so let's forgive his, let's say, I don't know what Jonathan knows about American history. Now, Jonathan, I'm sure, knows much more about American history than I know about Canadian history. I'll definitely concede that. But the point that I've made in many other videos is that these elements that came into the Pledge of Allegiance, the put on the coins, the Ten Commandment stone monuments outside courthouses, these came into American culture during the Cold War, the 1950s, the Eisenhower administration. Now, Dwight David Eisenhower had a very religious mother, and if you want to read some really interesting background on Dwight David Eisenhower without going into a full-blown biography of him, read David Brooks' The Road to Character, which is an excellent little book. Actually, on my blog, I wrote summaries of every chapter with meaty quotes from it. And Eisenhower was a very interesting character. Now Eisenhower, so this is the little write-up from my blog on Eisenhower. There's Eisenhower and his mother. A very interesting character Eisenhower was. Here's a little story that David Brooks, a little quote from the chapter. One Halloween evening when he was 10, Eisenhower's older brothers received permission to go out trick-or-treating, a more adventurous activity in those days than it is now. Ike wanted to go with them, but his parents told him he was too young. He pleaded with them, and he watched his brothers go and became engulfed with uncontrolled rage. He turned red, his hair bristled. Weeping and screaming, he rushed out into the front yard and began pounding his fist against the trunk of an apple tree, scraping the skin off and leaving his hands bloody and torn. His father shook him, lashed him with a hickory switch, and sent him up to bed. About an hour later, with little Ike sobbing in his pillow, his mother came up, sat silently rocking in the chair next to his bed. Eventually she quoted a verse from the Bible. He that conquereth his own soul is greater than he who taketh a city. Whoa, what a thing. Well, maybe I'll read some of my blog posts. I've written this a number of years ago. In Chapter 3, Brooks uses the story of Dwight Eisenhower and his mother Ida to illustrate the value of self-conquest. Ike had a temper and everyone knew it. He was raised in a culture of self-control, not self-indulgence. This is a big theme in David Brooks' book. It was Eisenhower's mastery of duplicity that allowed him to become an effective military leader and an effective president of the United States. He was not authentic. His duplicity was a skill he had cultivated through his life, and it was crucial for his ability to shape the world, even for good. Brooks shows himself in this chapter to be a conservative, to value a passing culture at the expense and to the derision of a present one. He gives us a nice brief biography of both Dwight Eisenhower and his mother, and shows the value of the passing world and the values of the passing world served, what those values served. If you recall the central theme of Brooks' project, it's to trace the path, virtues, and qualities of Adam 1 and Adam 2. This chapter nicely illustrates how the two atoms are deeply intertwined and at the same time in tension. It's difficult to see which in Eisenhower one should really value. Ike's cultivated inauthenticity allowed Adam 1 to succeed and prevail. Those are the resume virtues. He could passionately dismiss a lover, and at the end of his life left his family believing he was unknowable. Another quote from David Brooks' book. Ike's double nature could make it hard for people to really know him. I don't envy you trying to figure David out, John Eisenhower told biographer Evan Thomas. I can't figure him out. At his death, his widow, Mamie, was asked whether she had really known her husband. I'm not sure anyone did, she replied. But self-repression helped Eisenhower to control his natural desires and to fulfill the tasks assigned him both by his military superiors and by history. Not only he writes about moderation. Let's see what else. See, this is the problem. This is the problem about not preparing before one of my videos. Okay, in this portion by Brooks, he's talking about Ida Eisenhower, David Eisenhower's very religious mother. In places like Abilene, Kansas, the big sins left unchallenged would have very practical and disastrous effects. Sloth could lead to a failure of farm, gluttony and inebriation to the destruction of family, lust to the ruination of a young woman, vanity to excessive spending, debt, and bankruptcy. In places like that, people had an awareness not only of sin, but of the different kinds of sin, and different remedies for each. Some sins, such as anger and lust, are like wild beasts. They have to be fought through habits of restraint. Other sins, such as mockery and disrespect, are like stains. They can be expunged only by absolution, by apology, remorse, restitution, and cleansing. Still others, such as stealing, are like a debt. They can be rectified only by repaying what you owe to society. Sins such as adultery, bribery, and betrayal are more like treason than like crime. They damage the social order. Social harmony can be rewoven only by slowly recommitting to relationships and rebuilding trust. The sins of arrogance and pride arise from a perverse desire for status and superiority. The only remedy for them is to humble oneself before others. Now, what's important to note in American history was that the point that I've made many times, that in many ways in the 1950s during the Cold War, in opposition to godless communism, God became a very important part of American culture. It's only in the 1950s that "In God We Trust" came on the coins. Before then, they were ideas of liberty. Now, in many ways, I would assert that God was simply assumed. A book that I started reading after listening to this video of Jonathan Pageau's was Faith of the Founding Fathers. Now, the question of the faith of the founders of really the American Revolution, Constitution, Declaration of Independence, George Washington, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Madison, Monroe, Benjamin Franklin. This book, the Faith of Our Founding Fathers, I did a little bit of research before I picked up the book, seemed to be credible historically in terms of secular historians, but also Mark Knoll who is I assume still is a member of the South Bend Christian Reformed Church. Very competent historian, one that I trust to both be competent in terms of historical matters and also fair on religious matters. His was one of the blurbs on this book. Mark Knoll is an expert in American religious history. There's been a concerted effort in many camps to project certain contemporary forms of Christianity back onto the founding fathers. Many of the founding fathers were deeply influenced by deism, and deism. Well, let me just read a nice little example of. A good example of a deist would be Thomas Paine. Now, though technically not a deist, Edward Herbert, first Lord of the Herbert of Cherbury, formulated the classic 5 points of deism in the 17th century. Herbert stated, 1, there is a God. Okay, exactly. Now, what do you mean by this God? But there is a God, okay? And deists will say there is a God, and that's part of the difference between deists and atheists. Number 2, he ought to be worshipped. Number 3, virtue is the principal element in this worship. So the greatest way to worship this God was to live a virtuous life. 4, humans should repent of their sins. 5, there is life after death, where the evil will be punished and the good rewarded. This is a very basic, low-level version of religion, okay? And in fact, it might be something that I would call common religion in America. Sometimes this is best seen as, let's say, nominal Christianity. And this has been prevalent throughout the country for a very long time. Now, one of the things that this book observes is that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, many of these people supported churches in their lives. They gave to the building of churches. They attended churches. There's a rather important debate as to whether and how. There's a rather important debate in terms of George Washington's avoidance of partaking in Holy Communion, because communion and some of these elements of the Jesus story, Jesus would have been seen as a paragon of virtue, but these ideas of God incarnate and some of these other ideas for deists were sort of a bridge too far. Deists were in many ways similar to perhaps some of the atheists that we see today, but again, all of this God talk was present. All right. Now Eisenhower had learned duplicity, and he had learned self-restraint, and Eisenhower's capacity to manage people was what helped keep the alliance together and victory in the Second World War over Germany and the Nazis in the Second World War. And Brooks goes through that quite nicely in his book. But Eisenhower himself, much like many presidents of the United States, was not particularly religious. He wasn't religious like his mother. He had, like many people, sort of a successive generation nominal Christianity with a fairly deistic bent to it. And what's interesting about looking very closely as historians at the religion of the founding fathers is that this idea has permeated American life. Now, to jump back to Jonathan's video, it's interesting that In God We Trust came into the Pledge of Allegiance, came onto the coinage, Ten Commandments came into the courthouse. All of these religious movies came into Hollywood during the Cold War. It was sort of seen as being needed there. And broadly speaking, there at least was a consensus among Americans that placing it there was important and good. Church attendance reached its peak in the United States during the Cold War. Now, it could be, in fact, well, another point that I wanted to make about religious history in American and religious history and American history, American religious history. 9 of the 13 original colonies that became states had their own state churches. And Massachusetts was the last, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, was the last state to give up her state church. Now, what is a state church? Someone was complaining to me on Twitter the other day that I recommend too many books, and every time people ask me for book recommendations, I sort of stutter and I don't give them any. It's partly the reason here. So not only did I pick up this book on the faith of the Founding Fathers, but usually with things like this, I like to pick up more than one source so I can get different perspectives. And I found these great courses series to be quite good often, so I picked up this course on American religious history. Now, a state church obviously comes out of the Protestant period and the Peace of Augsburg. In many ways, before the Protestant Reformation in Europe, there was one Western church over Europe. And that Western church had gotten fairly tyrannical. Now, part of what happened in the Protestant Reformation was that the princes, not only did churches rebel against the Roman Church, but princes rebelled against the Roman Church. And that caused quite a bit of chaos, quite a bit of war. And so in the aftermath, what happened was various state churches arose. One of the most famous of those state churches is, of course, the Anglican Church. Now, the Anglican Church attempted to sort of bridge the divide during the reign of Elizabeth I, to sort of bridge the Catholic-Protestant divide and try and find an English way of there being one church. But of course, in that one church, there would be factions. So there would be a faction which was a little bit more Catholic, and a faction which would be a little bit more Calvinist, and all of this going on. The Netherlands, for example, had a state church. And the state church that came over across the ocean from the Netherlands to the New World would be, right now, the church in the United States, the Reformed Church of America. The Christian Reformed Church was, in many ways, one of the rebel churches that resisted state control. Now, why do I go into this with respect to Jonathan's video? Because I grew up in the Christian Reformed Church. The Christian Reformed Church had a lot of reticence, a lot of pause about getting into matters of church and state. And this element within the Christian Reformed Church was expressed by someone who would himself rebel against the Christian Reformed Church, one of historically the most successful ministers in the history of the Christian Reformed Church, someone named Herman Hoeksema, who would in fact leave the Christian Reformed Church over the question of common grace. You've heard me talk about the antithesis before. Before he left the Christian Reformed Church, during the First World War, there was quite a bit of tension between the Dutch and the Americans, let's call them. Before the First World War, Dutch immigrants came to the United States, kept trying to speak their native Dutch, kept worshiping in Dutch, started churches of their own. But during the First World War, where anti-German sentiment reigned high, many Christian Reformed churches started putting up flags in their sanctuaries to try to signal to their American neighbors that they were not German, but they were instead loyal Americans. Herman Hoeksema, man that he was, would not do so. And this caused a bit of a ruckus within Grand Rapids, Michigan, Granville Avenue, where he had his major congregation. Herman Hoeksema was basically planted a mega church at the beginning of the 20th century within the Christian Reformed Church within Grand Rapids, Michigan. And basically what happened when he lost the fight on common grace was he took his masses and left, which eventually became the Protestant Reformed Church. Now, most of you don't need to know any of that history. That's a little bit of West Michigan, Dutch Calvinist, fractious history. But the point was, I grew up in many ways having sort of a built-in animosity against American civil religion. And so did I lose my, no, I didn't. Part of what happened in my own history was that I grew up with, well, it wasn't that I was unpatriotic. I love my country, but I had a pretty strict hierarchy in mind in terms of God versus country. God always came before country. We didn't put flags in our church sanctuaries. It was fine to be patriotic. It was fine to celebrate the 4th of July. It was fine to put your hand over your heart during the Pledge of Allegiance. We said the Pledge of Allegiance in our Christian school, one nation under God. We pledged to the flag. We served the military. We did all of these things, okay? Christian Reformed people were loyal subjects of the Constitution of the United States. We're not loyal subjects of the king because, again, if you look back in American history, and this is actually important to Jonathan Pageau's point, what happens in American history is that unlike sort of the standard routine for state churches in Europe post-Reformation, where you had God, king, and subjects of the king, in the United States, the king was gone, and now we had a constitution. Now we had a set of processes and words in place of the king. So the President of the United States vows loyalty to serve the Constitution. Historically, in many countries of Europe, you would pledge loyalty to the king. Okay? It's a very important distinction. So now in the so what's happening in American history is that all this stuff is flowing through. You had state churches in 9 of the 13 colonies. Freedom of religion really starts in Rhode Island, that smallest of little states, and sort of spreads out from there. Because the Americas, the first chapter of Faith of the Founding Fathers, is really a wonderful tour of the various immigrant religious groups in America, because in many ways, America was filled with religious exiles from the state churches in Europe. Now, this was less so in the American South, because a lot of the motivation for emigration to the American South was economic, whereas emigration to the American North was made by north of the Mason-Dixon line. That became this really important line where mosquitoes and tobacco and cotton. Daniel was in jail when I started making videos. And I remember thinking many times, Daniel's a homeless guy. I was thinking many times, boy, I couldn't make these videos if I had Daniel knocking on my door every 15, 20 minutes. And Daniel's knocked on my door half a dozen times today. And I told him, I said, Daniel, this is it for today. And then he brings me a microwave dinner because he's hungry. And how am I not going to microwave his dinner? Anyway, I'm going to have to interrupt this 4 minutes from now to go manage the dinner in his microwave oven. Anyway, where was I? This also is the liability of not working from a PowerPoint. So you had these state churches, and you had the northern part of the country being very much founded by religious exiles from the state churches of Europe, and the southern part of the country, a little bit of mixture, much more economic refugees and economic entrepreneurs who were making money first with tobacco, later with cotton and other crops that were growing in the South, and that's also partly responsible for what happened with slavery in America. But, and again, as I said, while the federal government was secular, the states weren't necessarily. And so again, you even had state churches in some of these colonies. So Massachusetts had an official state church all the way into the 1830s. Okay? Now, one of I believe it was the professor, I forget where he teaches, of the Great Courses series, he's a Brit. and he made the observation, he's been living in America a while, he made the observation that state churches weaken the church. And as someone who grew up in America, someone of the particular tiny little thread of Dutch Calvinism that I grew up, I would agree. America has been a place, unlike Europe, where sort of the market forces and churches have flourished. Okay? But it had a very strong religious beginning. And so especially in the northern parts of the United States, north of the Mason-Dixon line, these were religious communities. These were religious communities that were so serious about their religiosity that they basically were persecuted in Europe for their various religious practices and came to the United States. Now, it doesn't mean they all agreed. In fact, they all disagreed with each other quite a bit, which was part of the reason for the shape and the practices of the various colonies. And so Anne Hutchinson, for example, would have to leave Massachusetts and go to Rhode Island. Roger Williams would have to leave Massachusetts and go to Rhode Island. And Rhode Island, again, became this place of religious liberty. Quakers, well, those of you who know American history know which is the Quaker state. That's Pennsylvania. Delaware was very much in that. The Dutch, of course, were in New York and New Jersey, and so on and so forth. So the American Northeast, north of the Mason-Dixon line, for a very long time was a hotbed of religious enthusiasm. Now, because these were highly religious people. You also have the Great Awakenings, 2 Great Awakenings, in fact, which would lead to this area in upstate New York called the Burned Over District. Religion was hyper in these areas, okay? Now, when the westward expansion happened, you might remember Mark Knoll's thesis. I gotta flip his microwave dinner. Hang on, he's pacing back and forth across my door. So I would say that a big part of this picture was this, all of these religious communities, but the founders of the revolution were these deists, and deists would look at these various churches and say, yeah, they're all excited, so on and so forth. But for the most part, the religious people, good for them. We can make a patchwork out of this because deism sort of became the least common denominator. And you look at a guy like Abraham Lincoln, who many of us reading back over him today were just, quite amazed at his power over religious imagery and language. Look at the second inaugural address. Abraham Lincoln was not much of a churchgoer. And again, you'd find this quite a bit in American history because, of course, again, if you go back and you look at the history of New England, a lot of those Puritans eventually became Unitarians, and you have, New England transcendentalism. You have that whole wave of history going on. But again, still you had this idea of God being around. Now, obviously, in the second half of the 19th century, you've got the rise of Darwin. You've got American universities that had, the vast majority of them had been founded as religious institution for the instruction of clergy, because especially in Protestants, and there are hardly any Roman Catholics in colonial America. There are very few Roman Catholics in the first half of the history of the United States. Almost everyone was Protestant, okay? And part of Protestantism was the desire for educated clergy. So the vast majority of universities, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, University of Pennsylvania, these are all religious schools designed to train clergy. And the job of clergy were, in many ways, to continue to do this work among the masses. All right. Now, of course, towards the end of the 19th century, you begin to have the rise of, deism is still out there, but it's beginning to fade. And increasingly, after Darwin, you have the rise of atheism. But again, numerically in the United States, these will not be large groups. Between deists and nominal Christians of just about every shape, the vast majority of Americans would, as is true today, continue to say that there is a God, so on and so forth. So this, of course, and again, there's a sort of a nominalism that sort of helps America get through these difficulties and not get tangled in the way that Europe had. One of the things to keep in mind when you think about this history is that it moves very slowly, especially compared to us. We're these creatures that live between 50 and 100 years often. And again, what was your average life expectancy at the beginning of the 20th century? 45, something like this. And of course, it's in the mid 70s now, and people live very short times, and so our frames of calibration are very small. And this history is moving much more slowly. And so again, by the end of the 19th century, we see this rise of post-millennialism, where sort of a scientific vision, kind of in a religious vision, kind of come together. Ideas of eugenics begin to come to the fore. Again, read, even someone like Abram Kuyper in his Stone lectures in Princeton. You read some of that, and some of these social Darwinist ideas are sort of seeping into the intelligentsia, and a lot of these social Darwinist ideas really won't get wrung out until sort of the vision of the Nazis comes full force and people sort of take a step back because they've been groomed by Christianity. All right? So now we get to the 1950s, and we have this existential struggle with the Soviet Union, both with, at some point, inevitably, both with nuclear weapons, and America doubles down on God. I think about what Dr. Jim said about the rise of new atheists, that in many ways, the rise of, it's kind of a counterintuitive argument. The rise of new atheists really signals that modernity is on decline. And perhaps the "in God we trust" in the money, "in God we trust" on the coinage, is kind of a signal that this religious base from the founding fathers, and the Southerners all believed in God, and the Northerners was very much religion heated, that this base of American nominalism was waning. And so, it was sort of propped up while godless communists were our adversaries. When that wall came down in 1989 and the towers came down in 2001, sitting here at 2020, the distance between 1989 and 2001 doesn't seem that large. In that period, belief in God came down. Now, belief in God is still very strong in the United States. And even those who count themselves the nuns are not necessarily godless. And so this word God continues to have power. But I would say that people today, many people, their idea of what God is has, now this is where I get sort of into my God number one, God number two, and Chuck Colson sort of as the example. Chuck Colson is Richard Nixon's hatchet man. And, in some ways he comes home to his wife and he says, "I've become a Christian." And she's a little bit shocked and said, "I thought we were Episcopalian." Well, what's going on with Charles Colson? Well, now he had a personal relationship with God. That's very much God number two. And God number one had receded so much that, what was God? And that's exactly what you hear when you have Sam Harris talking to Jordan Peterson. Because Jordan Peterson very much has some definite ideas about God and how this stuff all fits together. And in many ways, I think this is part of the reason, I got started making videos, this is part of the reason that Jordan Peterson had the effect that he did on somehow rejuvenating people's ideas about God. Now let's get back into some of Jonathan's video here.
One nation under God. We see it also on the currency. In God we trust. That is, that we need to submit to the highest principle in order for us to be able to cohere together.
Now, This is Pageau with his symbolic framework, very much understanding God number one. Okay? For many evangelicals who very much emphasize God number two, the narrative doesn't look like Pageau's. I mean, Pageau very much has a structural narrative, a theoretical narrative, and it's very coherent and it makes a lot of sense. If you listen to evangelicals talk about this, they'll say things like, well, unless Americans are obedient to God, God won't bless us. Now, the way that language is articulated, it's very deeply God number two. And it really sets up the likes of Sam Harris to say, oh, well, let's do a little test on this. Let's have these people who are obedient over here and these people who are disobedient over here, and we'll see which one flourishes. Well, of course, the problem with every test like that is, how long are you going to wait? 200-300 years? Do you have time for that kind of experiment? The point is that what we mean by this word God, when you listen to Jonathan Pageau talk about it, well, now after listening to Jonathan for a while, he's got a very definite idea about how this works, and he can point to that. You listen to, I don't know, Franklin Graham talk about it, and Franklin Graham's going to say things more about, he's going to tell a story that sees God very much as an agent, not as sort of this agentic arena, very much as this agent who is, acting on our behalf. It's in some ways, it's in some ways a neo-paganism, because the idea is basically, if we show allegiance to God, if we show loyalty to God, then God will grant us favor. Okay, and this is where it sort of comes in close with the prosperity gospel. And that's very far away from Pageau. Pageau is looking at it much more structurally, much more God number one. Now Pageau's God is fully God number one and God number two. But in terms of the emphasis, in terms of how people hear it, in terms of the narratives, Jonathan is very much, he's an artist, and he's setting up sort of a visual structural narrative. An evangelical would come in and talk much more about a interpersonal relational narrative of favor and loyalty and reward. All right? And so this is where, when I listen to Kanye, now suddenly things are sounding different.
And so, one God, one nation, we acknowledge the very, very highest, and then we acknowledge the thing which binds us together in terms of the nation. But the nations are arbitrary unless they are prone to conflict. They are prone to inner turmoil, to civil war, unless they are submitted to something which is above them. And
now again, when Jonathan Pageau speaks, he's much more like Jordan Peterson on this. And Jonathan would probably want me to clarify that, because, of course, Jonathan is a highly cognizant, loyal member of the Orthodox Church. And Jordan Peterson is fitting his own stuff together. But again, this is much more God as structure rather than God as, let's say, to put it in the worst light possible, something that Sam Harris would very much see it as, God as strong man. And if you're showing loyalty to the strong man, well, then the strong man will show loyalty to you. And again, when I listen to evangelicals talk about God, kind of the fullness of God number two in this, that tends to be the type of thing that I hear.
that is why all civilizations have always had a religious ideal to which they hold. And of course, the transcendent God of Christianity, the transcendent God of the West is, the highest possible thing that you can unify under. And
so And I think Jonathan's point here is correct, because after he said it, I began to think, okay, I'm going back through institutions, and have we seen long-standing empires that didn't serve a god? Communism didn't last very long. Why? Corruption. How does this function with respect to corruption? Here's the thing about a god. The police aren't everywhere, okay? You're not going to get caught everywhere. And so part of what happened in communism is they needed huge amounts of internalized state police to watch over everyone. In many ways, religion does this for you. If the culture has a very vivid sense of right and wrong, and again, deism was sufficient to provide this. You had a god who ought to be worshipped. Virtue is the principal element of worship. Humans should repent of their sins, and there's life after death where evil will be punished and good will be rewarded. Herbert's reduction of the essence of religion to these 5 points, as well as his reduction of revelation, caused many historians to view him as a forerunner, the father of deism. Okay, so even having significant doubts about a bunch of the lists that fundamentalists have, there was at least enough religiosity present structurally to provide a coherent nation. Now, this tweet by Jonathan caught my attention. Jonathan doesn't tweet out ideas as such that often. John will often be tweeting out a link to a video or something like that, but he doesn't tweet out his ideas very often. And so this one really caught my attention. If you want to build a civilization, you cannot do so on words like dark, rebel, and heterodox. By using these identifiers, you can criticize existing structures effectively, but you will never build anything of value and coherence. Now again, this very much is built on Jonathan's ideas, his structural ideas about how reality works, the patterns of reality. And what Jonathan is pointing to is that it brought up a lot of things in my mind, including the fact that in fiction it's almost always easier to create a compelling evil character than a compelling good character. Peter Kraft brings this up in commenting on C.S. Lewis's Aslan character in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Kraft notes that it's relatively easy to build compelling negative characters and evil heroes. It's much more difficult to build compelling good characters, because I think they in some ways sort of put us on a track towards doubting them. And so Jonathan's point here, you have rebel wisdom, you have heterodox academy, you have the intellectual dark web. Jonathan's point is well founded. Now, the Stone That the Builder Refused had a critique of this. How many systems have you created, mate? Must be an Australian. Anything that supports tens of millions of users, some constitutional creation and amendments in there, enterprise architecture, policy developments, performance monitoring, root cause analysis, perhaps. I saw this and I thought, I don't know if you know how people work and why a nation that has a coherent religious system with a God who sees and judges can, in fact, have the potential to create a nation that has to do all of the institutional mechanics and fact-checking all the way down to the bottom. What this response tweet, and I might be getting it completely wrong in terms of what the author meant, because Twitter's that prone to misunderstanding, which is in many ways why it's a terrible platform, which produces far more heat than light sometimes. But it seems you cannot fail to appreciate the impact of even nominal Christianity that America exploited to create the nation that it did. Which is a remarkable achievement, especially given the fact that, unlike English or the British Empire or the other European empires that would have God, king, the reason you have that hierarchy is so that, well, it functions. The Nazis were an attempt to really create sort of a naturalist empire, and it was a failure. It was a complete failure. The Third Reich, 1933 to 1945, 12 years, not a big run in terms of foundational civilizations. Communism, less than a century. What the Chinese are doing now isn't really communism. It's really sort of deeper Chinese cultural elements expressing themselves with a communist overlay. And even so, the reason that they're very concerned about religious movements is that the Chinese, unlike, it seems, most secular politicians in America, have a legitimate respect for the power of religion, which I think is part of the reason that sort of this woke fever has taken America by storm, because for the first time people are feeling religious, and they don't think it's religious because the word God isn't on it. Now, I caught this from a tweet from Dave Rubin, and he was just talking as a crazy person. And Dave Rubin is a very interesting case, because if you go back and you look at my commentary on Dave Rubin talking to, now I can only think of my impression of him, Kung Fu Panda apologist, John Lennox. Dave Rubin has really sort of defaulted back to this American deistic religious aspect. And you can hear that in the likes of Dennis Prager or Ben Shapiro. You've got Eric and Brett Weinstein still resisting it because they're sort of afraid of the God thing. But here Kanye comes around and whoosh, and Brett Weinstein wants to talk to him. But you can see from this little clip of this woman's talk exactly why. I remember I had a conversation with this distributist a while back, exactly why the woke religion might cause a whole lot of problem in the short term, but in the long run, it cannot stand, for exactly the reason Jonathan Pageau is pointing out what Kanye West has pointed out.
I use this definition of patriarchy. Now, the textbook definition is patriarchy is a system of oppressions that privileges male dominance. And that just kind of goes over people's head. So I want them to imagine an octopus. And the head of that octopus is patriarchy. And each one of those tentacles is capitalism, sexism, racism, ableism, ageism, homophobia, transphobia. And depending on where in the world you live, one or two or three or four or all 8 of those tentacles are working in unison to keep that head of the octopus, which is patriarchy, alive. Because people don't see it. It's like asking a fish what is water. When you ask a fish what is water, it doesn't know what you're talking about. What are you talking about? What is water? Because it's the very air we breathe is patriarchy. So it's universal. And then depending on where you live, each one of those tentacles of the octopus is that oppression that keeps patriarchy alive. So what we have to do in this moment is see that octopus. And I'm sorry, octopus, I know you're a beautiful creature, you're very intelligent, but you're also very devious because you get through cracks. And I want us to start cutting off all of those tentacles in order to destroy patriarchy. Because when people ask me, what is feminism? Feminism is the destruction of patriarchy. So I'm coming for you, octopus.
Okay, so, but notice what she had to do. She had to put something on the top. She had to put something on the top, and so she put feminism and patriarchy. And again, a few years ago, when I was really seeing this other religion rise, I started reading Everyday Feminism every day because I wanted to see what this one was. And I heard a lot of videos like this. But of course, if you talk to her, it's patriarchy. If you talk to Black Lives Matter, it's Black Lives Matter. And then you have people that say, well, it's all of it, but it's not going to cohere because it's not going to put any one thing at the top that under which everything else can fit, which is Jonathan Pageau's point. Now, of all the biblical lectures that Jordan Peterson did, the first one was, I think, the best and the most important. It was like he had all this stuff in him that was just waiting, and whoosh, it comes out. And I remember listening to this, for the first time, and what he was talking about. I've listened to this lecture many times, and each time I listen to it, I'm able to grasp it now because I've been, growing in a lot of these ideas. But he makes this point.
One of the debates, we might say, between early Christianity and the late Roman Empire was whether or not an emperor could be God, literally, right? To be deified, to be put in a temple. And you can see why that might happen, because that's someone at the pinnacle of a very steep hierarchy who has a tremendous amount of power and influence. But the Christian response to that was never confuse the specific sovereign with the principle of sovereignty itself. It's brilliant. You see how difficult it is to come up with an idea like that, so that even the person who has the power is actually subordinate to something else. Subordinate to, let's call it a divine principle, for lack of a better word. So that even the king himself is subordinate to the principle. And we still believe that because we believe that our president, our prime minister, is subordinate to the damn law, whatever the body of law, right? There's a principle inside that even the leader is subordinate to. And without that, you could argue you can't even have a civilized society, because your leader immediately turns into something that's transcendent and all-powerful. And I mean, that's certainly what happened in the Soviet Union and what happened in Maoist China and what happened in Nazi Germany, because there was nothing for the powerful to subordinate themselves to.
Right there. And it's not only for the powerful to subordinate themselves to, but everyone on down the line to subordinate themselves to that power too. And partly because, now Peterson in Maps of Meaning will make this point with respect to tyranny, but the same also holds with respect to other kinds of order that religion basically fills things up with.
Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which I would highly recommend. One of the things you find is that if you were arrested by the KGB, by the secret police in the Soviet Union, and you...
Little did that student right there know that her knee-high boots would make it in very famous videos.
were hauled off to like a tribunal, before a judge. They wanted you to admit that you were guilty. You had to. Like, they torture you until you confessed. Or you could just confess. And that, I always found that so mysterious. It's like they kick down your door. They know perfectly well that they haven't got any more on you than they've got on anyone else. And yet, you have to go through the damn trial, and you have to admit that they're right. It's like, why do they even bother with that? Why don't they just throw your sorry ass into the camp, which is essentially what's going to happen anyways? Why do they need your collaboration? I've never quite figured that out. I think it's partly because they're not willing to let you stand in opposition to the rules, because the mere fact that you'll do that means that you exist as something that is allowed to exist outside the rules. And they're not having any of that. So that's part of it. But there's more to it. There's more to it than that. It's like the drama of collaboration. So one of the things I learned about societies like the Soviet Union, and this is true of all tyrannical societies, is that the idea that that's top down and that people are just following orders. They're good people, but they're just following orders. It's like, you can forget about that. That's a stupid theory. When a society becomes tyrannical like that, the tyranny exists at every single level of the society. You tyrannize your own conscience. So let's say you're a true believer.
Now, if it's true that the tyranny lives at every level of society, other aspects too. And I remember when I listened to this, I thought, this is so true of religion as well. That when you grow up religious, as I did, that, there's elements of things that you just don't do. Well, why don't you do it? Because you learned these things when you were very young. And these things got into us. And be careful, little eyes, what you see, and be careful, little ears, what you hear. And so there's an element of tyranny all the way down, but it makes a tremendous difference what that tyranny is.
Believer. You're a true believer in Marxist utopia, let's say, or National Socialist Third Reich that's going to last 1,000 years and be racially pure. You really believe that. And that's supposed to be a perfect state. And
you can see Peterson practicing his little speaker trick of always focusing on one person. I'm sure that's probably rather unnerving for the student that's sitting in the classroom.
That's already been delivered to you. And so what that means is that insofar as you're a true believer, your own suffering becomes heretical. Because to the degree that you're suffering, you're living proof of the fact that the system is not delivering what it promised to deliver. And so you have to suppress that. You have to become your own tyrant. You can't admit that anything's gone wrong. And of course, you can't talk about it to your family because 1 out of 3 of them are government informers, just like 1 out of 3 of everyone. And you're certainly not going to mention it in the workplace because unless you're a devout Communist Party member, you're not going anywhere. And if any of your ancestors were like landowners or bourgeoisie, it's like you're done. You're done.
So you have this self-tyranny that happens, okay? And so I want to go
to the structure of reality. He's showing us how reality works and how, if we want for things to hold together, how the order of the way things have to be. So you have God above, you have a unifying vision, and then you can build the future. Then you can acquire the potentiality of the future, and you can unite it into your one vision, okay? It's the same for any project. Will have to have a unifying vision so that you can build the future, take the potentiality that comes to you and unite it to the unknown that comes to you and unite it into the one vision.
Okay, you have this future. Now I want to jump back to a little bit at the end of Jordan Peterson's biblical series. Now it makes a tremendous difference what this tyranny is about. And if you look at my last video, I talked about the difference between knights and mooks. That knights use mooks and mooks use knights. And the mooks sort of are able to Voltron up into a little bit of a bigger Voltron via their knight. And there's sort of a relationship between the knights and the mooks, and if the mooks get out ahead of the knight has to go find where his mooks are and go be their leader again, because otherwise the mooks will go and find a new knight. And that's just sort of how politics normally works. But of course, you go back to that C.S. Lewis quote, and Christ isn't looking for mooks. And he's looking for sons of God and friends. Now, when Jonathan is talking about the future here, once you have, because it's not your instantiation, it's the highest thing at the top of it structurally, has to be big enough to encompass everything. It also has to encompass the future. And then I was just this morning finishing up again Biblical Series number 1, and I noticed this because I remember catching this when he did his Easter message in 2018, it would be, okay? And about the future. And again, what he lays out here is very, very interesting.
Look, I want to read you a couple of things that we'll use as a prodroma for the next lecture, because...
And I was actually kind of sad when I looked at this because, I watched his conversation with his daughter, and he's got a long ways to go, if ever we'll see this man again as he was here. And that's a very sad thing. I hope he can get back to it.
I'll just bounce through a collection of ideas that's associated with the notion of divinity, okay? And then we'll turn back to the first lines when we start the next lecture. I have no idea how far I'm going to get through the biblical stories, by the way, because I'm
Not far.
trying to figure this out as I go along. Okay, so, there's an idea in Christianity that the image of God is a trinity, right? There's the Father, there's the element of the Father, there's the element of the Son, and there's the element of the Holy Spirit. And it's something like tradition, the spirit of tradition. It's something like the human being as the newest incarnation of that tradition, like the living incarnation of that tradition. And then it's something like the spirit in people that makes relationship with this and this possible, the spirit in individuals. And so I'm going to bounce my way quickly through some of the classical metaphorical attributes of God so that we kind of have a cloud of notions about what we're talking about when we return to Genesis 1 and talk about the God who spoke chaos into being. So there's a fatherly aspect. So here's what God as a father is like. You can enter into a covenant with it, so you can make a bargain with it. Now you think of
Now it's important for Peterson here because he's again in these series he's talking about, well, these are abstracted ideas, okay, for Peterson, and he'll qualify that a little bit later, but
think about that. Money is like that, because money is a bargain you make with the future, right? And so we've structured our world so that you can negotiate with the future. And I don't think that we would have got to the point where we could do that without having this idea to begin with. You can act as if the future is a reality. There's a spirit of tradition that enables you to act as if the future is something that can be bargained with. That's why you make sacrifices.
And again, that tweet that responded to Jonathan, I don't know if that person sees these deep things that are so deep within us. And so often the technocrats, and this is one of my criticisms of the Weinstein brothers, the technocrats' solution to the future aren't deep enough, because what Peterson is talking about here is extremely deep. I mean, money. Well, what is money? And you have to sit and think about it before you really become to notice that money is a profoundly religious thing. It's not, yes, there's a technical aspect of it, and certainly you need technical knowledge and technical proficiency in terms of managing it as a society, but the idea of it itself cannot be simply assumed. It has to be developed. And any new society that you want to start would carry with it all of these deep things, because you would die before you could reinvent this stuff.
Right? And the sacrifices were acted out for a very long period of time, and now they're psychological. We know that you can sacrifice something valuable in the present and expect that you're negotiating with something that represents the transcendent future. And that's amazing human discovery. Like no other creature can do that.
And now what's interesting is that when Peterson says it's a human discovery, it isn't even that humans know they're discovering it. They start doing it, and it starts to work. But it's not like we all sit around and spec it out. It emerged slowly among us.
To act as if the future is real. To note that you can bargain with reality itself and that you can do it successfully. It's unbelievable. It responds to sacrifice. It answers prayers. I'm not saying that any of this is true, by the way. I'm just saying what the cloud of ideas represents. It punishes and rewards. It judges and forgives. It's not nature. You see, one of the things that's weird about the Judeo-Christian tradition is that God and nature are not the same thing at all. Whatever God is, partially manifest in this logos, is something that stands outside of nature. And I think that's something like consciousness as abstracted from the natural world.
Now right there is what Pageau is talking about. That it's got to be above it. It can't be nature. And that's why pantheism fails. It can't be nature. And of course, Peterson is trying to express it as a theoretical concept that can somehow make it more understandable to us. And I think, again, this sort of step stool that Peterson does is sort of where, in the words of Destiny that Rationality Rules was complaining to, people are just, they step right over the line. Peterson doesn't actually go over it. He stops right there. But once you get to the end, it's like, why don't I take the next step? It's like Truman Show. He climbs those steps at the edge of the wall and then finds the door. And what are you going to do, Truman? Walk through. Why not? What on this side of the wall is really here for you?
So it built Eden for mankind and then banished us for disobedience. It's too powerful to be touched. It granted free will. Distance from it is hell. Distance from it is death. It reveals itself in dogma and in mystical experience, and it's the law. So
right there, that's what happened in the United States. It said, okay, we're not going to have a king anymore as an intermediary. We're going to have the law. And so the President of the United States puts his hand on a Bible or whatever book he wants to and pledges to defend the Constitution. The military, they don't pledge to defend the king. They pledge to defend the Constitution. But how does that work in America? Well, all of these religious people, well, they all know what God is, and they've got all these different particularities down below, but the same basic framework works good enough that, okay, I'll at least agree not to go to war against the Mennonites and the Amish and the Baptists and the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox, because we little Dutch Calvinists wouldn't last long. There's just not that many of us. But God, okay, as long as you don't make me put the flag in my sanctuary.
that's sort of like the fatherly aspect. And then the son-like aspect, it speaks chaos into order. It slays dragons and feeds people with the remains. It finds gold. It rescues virgins. It's the body and blood of Christ.
Now, why son? What is a son in this narrative? Well, read the Gospels. The son is the prince that comes to the territory on behalf of the king. That's how the son is. The king is far back in the palace. The son is the one who comes local. Why is Jesus the Son of God? Okay? In Christian theology, that doesn't mean that, like Zeus, God got jiggy with some hot chick and boom, there's Hercules. That's not how it works at all. And so when Jesus is talking about the Son of God, it's talking about his function with respect to the structure of the earth. That's what the Son does.
It's a tragic victim and scapegoat and eternally triumphant redeemer simultaneously. It cares for the outcast. It dies and is reborn. It's the King of kings and hero of heroes. It's not the state, but is both the fulfillment and critic of the state. It dwells in the perfect house. It is aiming at paradise or heaven. It can rescue from hell. It cares for the outcast. It's the foundation stone and the cornerstone that was rejected. And it's the spirit of the law. And then it's spirit-like. It's akin to the human soul. It's the prophetic voice. It's the still small voice of conscience. It's the spoken truth. It's called forth by music. It is the enemy of deceit, arrogance, and resentment. It's the water of life. It burns without consuming, and it's a blinding light. Okay, so that's a very well-developed set of poetic metaphors, essentially, right? So these are all, what would you say, glimpses of the transcendent ideal. That's the right way of thinking about it. They're glimpses of the transcendent ideal. And all of them have a specific meaning. And, well, in part, what we're going to do is go over that meaning as we continue with this series. And so what we've got now is a brief description, at least, of what this is. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We know it's associated with the logos in this sequence of stories. We know it's associated with the word and with consciousness, and we know that it's associated with whatever God is. And then I laid out the metaphoric landscape that at least in part describes God, and so now we have some sense of the being that does this.
Now, so growing up, I was always annoyed at when politicians used God. Why? It was sort of like using a friend of mine. It was very much God number two. And I was annoyed because of my roots in this anti-state church tradition that I was raised in. And there were elements of that were built into me. There were instincts and suspicions and reactions that were built into me by 3-4 generations. And I didn't even know it. And so when politicians would say, God bless you and God bless America, I always sort of cringed because, well, let's look at the religious lives of American presidents from the end of the 20th century until now. You know, Roosevelt, was he Episcopalian? That would be my guess. Not a terribly religious man. Eisenhower, we already talked about him. John F. Kennedy, you know, talk about, well, however he was a president, he was a sex addict. LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, man from the South. Richard Nixon, a Quaker. Some moral issues. Most of these presidents were not kings as such. They were presidents. They were there to do a job. But this religiosity, this civil religion, as Robert Bellah would call it, was part and parcel of the United States. And I think part of what happened was, as this deism was receding, of course, in the 80s, there were a number of evangelical attempts to sort of prop it up, but didn't really work. Ronald Reagan, the first divorced president of the United States, again, not a churchgoer. Jimmy Carter, probably one of the most religiously observant presidents we've had in the last 70 years, you know, only had one term, did not succeed as a president. George Herbert Walker Bush, good man from what I could see. Episcopalian, quite likely. But again, I have Chuck Colson ringing in the back of my ears. You've become a Christian. I thought we were Episcopalian. And then George W. Bush, of course, part of the campaign strategy was to promote his relationship with Billy Graham. And again, George W. Bush seemed like a decent man. Then, of course, Bill Clinton, another Southern Baptist, not necessarily supported by many Southern Baptists. We had some other presidential candidates like the next JFK, John Kerry, for whom certain Roman Catholic priests threatened to not serve him communion because of his stand on abortion. And so what you can begin to see is that this deism, this nominal Christianity that has served as sort of a civil religion, afforded the nation a structure. And so I'm not surprised to see Dave Rubin sort of go, you know, have a crush on Dennis Prager. Very much trying to get back at that Cold War deism and reinstate it. Now Kanye comes along. Kanye having his own church services, his own Sunday, I forget what they're called, his own Sunday sessions with all of his music, making religion cool again. Very much as Jonathan Pageau talks about him being the clown. Jonathan was just on the Stoa, and I thought his descriptions there were maybe clearest to me. Maybe that's just because I'm getting up to speed with John, and because in some ways, you know, this learning process is very transjective. I understand Jordan now, the better I understand Jordan. I understand Jonathan now, the better I understand Jonathan.
My contention in general about the fool is that the fool is the one who turns things. So the image of the clown is perfect. He's on a ball, he's rolling a ball, he's juggling, and so the fool is the one who turns things. And so when things are going well, what the fool tends to do is to turn things upside down, right? To show the upside down of something. So the king is all pompous and is extremely proud of himself, and so the king will lift up his skirt and will point to the thing that's hidden, right? He'll point to the hidden things which are in the shadow.
The fool will point to the hidden things that are in the shadow. I think Jonathan misspoke.
As I'd say. And so the clown is always kind of turning things, right? And he's emphasizing excess, caricature, all of that. Now, the problem is that when the world is upside down, then what's the role of the clown? When everything is already topsy-turvy, what does the clown do? Well, the clown keeps turning. The clown will turn things. And so what I've been trying to point out is that when the world is upside down, watch the fools, because the fools are the ones who are actually going to turn things right side up, who are going to turn things back towards order. And so I saw that already in Kanye a long time ago. In 2004, he did this song called Jesus Walks, which was a really strange song because it was a song about street life and hustling and all these things. But then he talks about how Jesus walks with the lowest, basically. So he's saying, he's talking about he needs to go do a drug deal and he's going to leave his mom to do a drug deal. And he says, I hope that Jesus walks with me. And so he's connecting like the highest thing with the lowest, okay?
Because that's what Jesus does. And Jonathan articulates that quite well. I discovered it when I was going through the Gospel of Luke and I was reading through Joel Green's commentary. And for the first time, I began to have an appreciation for how Jesus deals with status. And how Jesus, and it's right there in Philippians too. I mean, why couldn't I see it? Jesus is the highest, did not consider equality with God something to be exploited, but became the lowest, the very nature of a servant, and therefore became the highest. And you find this happening again and again and again and again in the Bible, with Jesus. He's the lowest and the highest. And you call me master, now I call you brothers. Jesus is always working both of these axes back and forth, but in an orderly way, not in a way that brings chaos, but rather in a way that brings order.
So I've been watching him since then, and now he basically became a conservative Christian.
And after I got some of these first things with Kanye, I began to look for a biography of Kanye, and there's some pretty good biography YouTubes on Kanye, and looked at the story of his mother and his relationship with his father, and his relationship with a porn star for a while, and then his relationship with Kim Kardashian, and then his conversion to Christianity. And it's, in a sense, Kanye has gone full round the circle. He reached the top of what this world had to give and saw it was destructive, and so then he goes down to the bottom and becomes the Christian.
He had a conversion experience, and he's all like pro family, he's all about he's become super conservative, and he's not the first one for who that happens. I've been watching certain characters in the past few years. One of the examples I give is Gavin McInnes, who obviously he's been really, really kind of thrown around in the media, but as a character he was interesting because he founded Vice News. And he was a punk. He was a punk, pervert, all this stuff, and all of this. At some point, it's like the whole world became like him. What does a punk do when the whole world is punk rock? And so he's like, I can't stand this. And then he started to point back to to normalcy. Got married, had kids, became a Knights of Columbus. Started wearing buttoned-up shirts, and it's like he was just. It's like when the world is exceptional, the exceptional points back to the rule. It happens very naturally. And so Kanye, I think that's what Kanye is doing. So if you look at his tweet, it's crazy because he says we need, I forget the exact wording, but it's like we need to follow God and to find our unifying principle or whatever. And that's why I'm running for president of the United States. That's Kanye West who is writing that. Like, you know, the guy who would dress up in a big teddy bear suit, that guy is saying we need to go back to God and find our unifying principle. And so that's what I mean when I talk about the fool, kind of watching the fool at the end, because the fool is the one who's going to bring back order. I mean, whether you agree with the order he brings back or not, that's not even the point. To watch it as a phenomena is to just see it happen. Like, Kanye West is more conservative than Donald Trump. That's how weird this world is.
That's exactly right. So, again, this terribly disorganized video, maybe it's just finally incoherent, but I'll post it anyway because I will. While as a Christian minister, I am always inviting people into deeper levels of commitment with the triune God, deeper participation into the life of Christ via his church. I am perhaps, because of this, less disturbed by nominalism. This religious nominalism, it seems, has been a stabilizing factor in American society that at least produced something that gave the culture ballast. I'm still thinking this through. But it's fascinating to watch, and it's, again, part of the reason that I think Jordan and Jonathan are two very important figures in figuring out where society goes.